He thought he'd taken everything from me. My home, my family, every trace of my father's memory. The house Dad built with his own hands. The workshop where he taught me to measure twice and cut once. Even the pencil marks on the doorframe tracking my height through the years. Steve methodically erased it all, replacing my father's legacy with his cheap modern fixtures and white walls. But he didn't know about the secret Dad left me. The one thing he couldn't steal, hidden in legal documents and trust funds, waiting for the perfect moment to strike back. By the time he discovered the truth, it was already too late. My name is Madison Carter, and until 6 months ago, I thought I understood what loss meant. I was 35, a software engineer at a tech firm in downtown Denver, living the kind of life my father had always envisioned for me. Independent, successful, grounded. But everything I'd become traced back to him, to Richard Carter, the man who taught me that buildings weren't just structures. They were stories waiting to be preserved. Dad wasn't just a businessman in construction. He was an artist who specialized in breathing life back into forgotten places. His company restored historical buildings across Colorado, saving them from demolition and transforming them into living pieces of history. He'd come home with sawdust in his hair and stories about exposed beams from the 1890s, or original hardwood hidden under decades of linoleum. His eyes would light up describing every discovery like he'd found buried treasure. Our house was his masterpiece, a 2-story craftsman built in 1923 that he bought as a wreck when I was 3. I grew up watching him restore it. Board by board, room by room, he'd let me help, teaching me to sand with the grain, to respect the wood, to understand that craftsmanship meant patience. Every Saturday morning, we'd work in his workshop in the garage, the smell of cedar and pine oil becoming as familiar as his cologne. Madison, he'd say, adjusting my small hands on the sander. This house is more than walls and a roof. It's our family's heart. Every nail, every joint, every coat of stain. It all matters because we are not just building shelter. We are creating legacy. He documented everything meticulously. 3 filing cabinets in his study contained receipts, photographs, and detailed notes about every repair, every original fixture he'd salvaged, every period-appropriate replacement he'd sourced from estate sales and demolition sites. The house became a living museum of our family's dedication. The doorframe between the kitchen and dining room bore the evidence of my childhood. Pencil marks with dates, tracking my height from age 4 to 18. Dad would make such a ceremony of it each birthday, having me stand barefoot against the frame while Mom took pictures. Even after I moved out for college, he insisted on continuing the tradition every visit home. His workshop remained exactly as he'd organized it. Tools hung on pegboard outlines he'd traced himself. Jars of sorted screws and nails lined the shelves he'd built. His workbench, scarred from decades of projects, held the vice he'd inherited from his own father. Everything had its place, and everything told a story. When the heart attack took him last year, it was swift and devastating. One moment he was reviewing blueprints for a Victorian renovation downtown. The next he was gone. No warning, no goodbye, just an empty space where his laughter used to fill our house. But even in death, Dad had planned ahead. His will was detailed, specific, ironclad. The house went to me along with strict provisions, no structural changes without historical preservation approval, no selling for at least 10 years, and maintenance had to follow the detailed guides he'd left. He'd even established a fund specifically for the house's upkeep. He talked about this place like it was another child, our family lawyer, Henry Lawson, had said, sliding the documents across his mahogany desk. Richard wanted to make sure it stayed in the family, preserved exactly as he'd intended. Mom had nodded numbly beside me, lost in her grief. At 56, Elaine Carter had lost not just her husband, but her best friend, her companion of 38 years. I watched her shrink into herself, moving through the house like a ghost, touching Dad's things, but never moving them, as if keeping everything in place might somehow bring him back. I thought I was prepared for the grief. I thought I understood my role as keeper of Dad's legacy. The house would stand as his monument, and I would be its guardian. Mom would heal in time, surrounded by the familiar walls that held so many memories. I was naive enough to believe that grief was our only enemy, that time was our only battle. I didn't know that within 6 months a stranger would walk through our door and try to erase everything my father had built. I didn't know that protecting his legacy would mean declaring war on my own mother's happiness. But I'm getting ahead of myself. First, you need to understand what this house meant, what it represented, because only then can you comprehend what I was willing to do to save it. The grief support group met every Thursday evening in the basement of St. E. Matthew's Episcopal Church. I'd driven Mom there myself the first few times, sitting in the parking lot, scrolling through work emails while she spent 90 minutes with other widows and widowers. By the 3rd month, she insisted on driving herself. I need to do this alone, Madison, she'd said, clutching her purse with Dad's photo tucked inside. I need to find my own way through this. I should have paid attention when she started coming home lighter, almost glowing. I should have noticed when she began wearing lipstick again, when she stopped crying at Dad's chair in the living room. But I was drowning in my own grief, buried in work projects that kept me from thinking too much. His name was Steve Dawson, 58 years old, silver-haired with the kind of tan that suggested golf courses and leisurely retirements. He'd lost his wife to cancer 2 years prior, he said, and understood the particular ache of an empty bed and silent mornings. Mom introduced him to me 6 weeks after they'd met. She'd invited me for Sunday dinner, our new tradition since Dad's passing. And there he was, standing in our kitchen wearing Dad's apron, the one with Master of the Grill embroidered across the front. Madison. Honey, Mom said, her cheeks flushed like a teenager's. This is Steve. He's been such a wonderful support. He extended his hand, his grip firm, but somehow oily. I've heard so much about you, he said. Your mother talks about you constantly. The brilliant software engineer following in her father's footsteps of building things that last. The comparison to Dad felt calculated, rehearsed. Everything about Steve felt rehearsed. From his sympathetic head tilts to his perfectly timed touches on Mom's shoulder. He knew exactly when to refill her wine glass, when to laugh at her stories, when to look wistful and mention how empty his apartment felt. Within a month, he was at every family gathering. He brought flowers, always carnations, never the roses Dad favored. He fixed the leaky faucet in the powder room, making a show of his handiness while using the wrong type of sealant. He complimented Mom's cooking with excessive enthusiasm, as if a pot roast was worthy of a Michelin star. He's trying so hard, my Aunt Patricia whispered at Easter dinner. Poor man just wants to belong. But I saw the way his eyes inventoried our house. Lingering on the restored crown molding, the original hardwood floors, the custom built-ins Dad had crafted. He asked casual questions about property values in the neighborhood, about the size of the lot, about whether we'd ever considered modernizing certain elements. That workshop's quite large, he mentioned one evening, peering through the garage window. Could easily be converted to an apartment. Generate some rental income for your mother. Dad's workshop stays as it is, I said firmly. He raised his hands in mock surrender. Of course, just thinking practically. Your mother mentioned the maintenance costs can be overwhelming. Mom hadn't mentioned anything of the sort to me. But suddenly, she was nodding, talking about property taxes and heating bills, as if they'd become crushing burdens overnight. Dad's life insurance and pension had left her more than comfortable, but Steve painted pictures of financial anxiety that hadn't existed before. The announcement came on a humid Thursday in June, 6 months after Dad's death. Mom called me to the house, and I found them sitting on the living room sofa, Dad's sofa, holding hands. "We have wonderful news," Mom said, her voice trembling with what I initially mistook for nervousness. "Steve and we've decided he's going to move in." The room tilted. "Move in here? Where else would he move in?" Mom laughed, but it sounded forced. "His apartment lease is ending, and it seems silly for us to maintain two places when we spend all our time together." "Mom, it's been 6 months since your father died." "Yes," her voice turned sharp. "I'm aware of the timeline, Madison. I'm also aware that I'm 56 years old, alone in this big house, and I found someone who makes me happy. Don't I deserve that?" Steve squeezed her hand, playing the supportive partner perfectly. "Madison, I know this is difficult. I'm not trying to replace your father. No one could. I just want to take care of your mother, to be there for her." "Then get your own place together," I said. "This is Dad's house." "This is my house too," Mom shot back. "I lived here for 20 years. I raised you here, and I have every right to invite whomever I choose to share it with me." The argument that followed was ugly. I reminded her of Dad's will, his wishes, the legacy he'd built. She accused me of wanting her to be a permanent widow, a guardian of a museum instead of a living woman with needs and desires. Steve sat silent through it all, occasionally patting Mom's hand, letting her fight his battle for him. When I finally left that night, Mom called after me from the porch, "He moves in next week. Madison, you can either be part of our lives or not, but I'm not asking for permission to be happy." Standing by my car, I looked back at the house, Dad's craftsman masterpiece glowing warm under the porch lights he'd installed. For the first time since his death, it didn't feel like coming home. It felt like watching an invasion begin. The changes started small, so subtle, I almost convinced myself I was being paranoid. Steve moved in on a Saturday while I was at work, a deliberate choice, I realized later, to avoid confrontation. When I stopped by that evening, his presence had already begun seeping into the house like water damage. His recliner sat where Dad's reading chair had been. The leather monstrosity clashed with every carefully chosen piece in the living room. Its cup holders and electronic controls were an insult to the arts and crafts aesthetic Dad had cultivated. Mom's explanation came quickly, nervously. "Steve has back problems. He needs proper lumbar support." Within 2 weeks, Dad's workshop had its first violation. I'd gone to retrieve a screwdriver to fix a loose cabinet handle in my apartment, only to find Steve's golf clubs leaning against Dad's workbench. Boxes labeled, "Steve's Things," crowded the shelves where Dad's restoration hardware had been meticulously organized. "Just temporary storage," Steve said, appearing in the doorway with practiced casualness. "Your mom said there was extra space out here." "Where are Dad's tools?" I asked. "Oh, we reorganized a bit. Some of those rusty old things were safety hazards. I got rid of the worst ones." My hands shook as I opened drawer after drawer, finding Dad's antique hand planes replaced with cheap power tools from big box stores. His collection of vintage screwdrivers, some dating to the 1920s, the same era as our house, had vanished. "Those were restoration tools," I said, my voice barely controlled. "They were worth thousands of dollars." "Really?" Steve's surprise was theatrical. "They looked like junk to me. But hey, I saved the newer stuff. Much more practical." Mom defended him. "Of course, Madison. You never used that workshop. Steve actually does projects around here. He's being helpful." The projects Steve did were systematic erasures. The built-in bookshelf Dad had crafted from reclaimed barnwood was painted white. "Brightens the space," Steve declared. The vintage doorknobs throughout the house, carefully sourced from architectural salvage yards, were replaced with modern brushed nickel. Much more secure, he insisted. But the worst betrayal came on a Tuesday afternoon, when I stopped by unannounced. I heard voices from upstairs, and climbed to find two strangers in the guest rooms. "Oh, Madison." Mom appeared, flustered. "I didn't know you were coming. This is Lisa and James, Steve's children." Lisa, 32 and pregnant, lounged on the bed in what had been my childhood room. Her belongings were already scattered across the dresser. James, 30, was setting up a gaming system in Dad's former study. "Dad said we could stay as long as we need," Lisa said, not bothering to sit up. "My apartment got too expensive, and with the baby coming and I'm between jobs," James added with a shrug that suggested this was a chronic condition. "They are family now," Mom said weakly when I pulled her into the hallway. "Steve's been helping them financially for years. We have the space." We didn't just have the space. We had Dad's carefully preserved rooms, each one a testament to his craftsmanship. Within days, Lisa had torn down the vintage wallpaper in my old room to paint a gender-neutral beige for the baby. James had drilled holes in the original plaster walls to mount his television screens. The house began to smell different. Gone was the mixture of lemon oil and old wood that I associated with home. Instead, there was Steve's cologne, Lisa's perfumes, James' cigarette smoke that drifted in from the back porch, where he spent his unemployed days. Steve started referring to it as our home in every conversation. At family gatherings, he'd give tours as if he'd been there for decades, getting the history wrong, attributing Dad's work to previous owners or general contractors. He installed a security system without consulting anyone, changing the codes weekly and forgetting to give them to me. "For your mother's safety," he explained when I confronted him. "You can't be too careful these days." The final desecration came on a Thursday morning. I'd let myself in with my key, while I still had one, to retrieve a photo album Mom had promised me. The house was quiet. Everyone was supposedly out. I walked through the dining room and froze. The doorframe, our height chart, the record of my entire childhood, had been sanded smooth and repainted. I ran my fingers over the pristine white paint, searching for any trace of the pencil marks underneath. Nothing. 20 years of tradition, of Dad's careful printing of dates, of Mom's little notes about first days of school and lost teeth, erased. "Oh, that," Steve said behind me. I hadn't heard him come in. It was looking shabby. "All those marks and scratches. I fixed it up nice for your mother." "Those weren't scratches," I whispered. "Those were memories." "Well, memories don't increase property value," he said with a chuckle. "This house could be worth a fortune with the right updates. Your mom deserves to live in a modern space, not a museum." That night, I called Henry Lawson. "I need to review Dad's will again," I said. "Every detail, every provision, everything." "Trouble at home?" the lawyer asked carefully. "Something like that." I heard him shuffling papers. "Your father was very thorough, Madison. Very protective. Why don't you come by tomorrow? There are some documents we should discuss. Things your father set up that, well, that he hoped would never be necessary." Hanging up, I looked around my apartment at the few pieces I'd salvaged from Dad's workshop. A hand plane, a level, his favorite hammer. They were all I had left of him now that Steve was systematically erasing him from his own house. But maybe, just maybe, Dad had seen this coming. Maybe he'd prepared for a war I was only beginning to understand. Henry Lawson's office occupied the top floor of a restored Victorian downtown. The kind of building Dad would have loved. The lawyer himself was in his 70s, with silver hair and sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He'd handled Dad's legal affairs for 20 years. Your father, he began, pulling out a thick folder, was one of the most thorough men I've ever met. He updated his estate planning every year, and after his diagnosis of high blood pressure, 3 years ago, he never told you, he became even more meticulous. He said he didn't want to worry you or your mother, but he knew his father died of a heart attack at 60, his grandfather at 58. Richard was determined to have everything in order. Henry spread several documents across his desk. The house is held in a very specific trust. Madison, you're the sole beneficiary, but more importantly, you're the sole trustee. Your mother has lifetime residency rights, but no ownership stake and no authority to make structural changes. But she's acting like she owns it because she doesn't know the full details. Henry adjusted his glasses. Your father set up what we call a quiet trust. The deed still shows both their names for public record, but the actual controlling documents supersede that. He didn't want your mother to feel diminished in her own home, but he wanted protection in place. Protection from what? I asked. He couldn't have known about Steve, Henry replied. No, but he knew your mother. Forgive me for speaking plainly, but Richard worried about her tendency to be influenced by others. Her sister talked her into that failed investment in 2015. Remember, he wanted to ensure the house remained protected from any future complications. Henry pulled out another document. There's also this, he said, pulling out another document. A restoration protection covenant filed with the Denver Historical Society. Any structural changes to the house require not just your approval as trustee, but also historical review. The penalties for unauthorized modifications are severe. How severe? I asked. Civil penalties up to $100,000, plus restoration costs. And here's the interesting part, Henry continued. Your father also established a separate emergency fund accessible only to you, specifically for legal proceedings related to the house. My hands trembled as I read through the papers. Dad had thought of everything. Steve's already made changes, I stated, my voice firm. Painted over original wood, removed fixtures. Document everything, Henry instructed. Photographs, receipts, witnesses. Every modification, without your written consent, as trustee is actionable. He leaned forward. Madison, your father also left you this. He handed me a sealed envelope with my name and Dad's handwriting. Inside, a single key and a note, Safety Deposit Box 447, First National Bank, for when you need to fight for what matters. The next morning, I went to the bank. The box contained more than I expected. $50,000 in bonds, copies of every receipt and photograph from the house restoration, and a leather journal filled with Dad's notes. The final entry, dated a week before his death, made me cry. Madison, it read, if you're reading this, then someone is trying to take our house. Don't let them. This isn't about property or money. It's about preserving something real in a world that tears everything down for profit. Be strong. Be smart. Be patient. The law is on your side, but only if you use it wisely. I spent the next 3 weeks in covert documentation mode. I arrived at the house when Steve was golfing, taking hundreds of photographs. I found receipts in the trash for the improvements he'd made, carefully smoothing them out and scanning them. I recorded conversations on my phone when he bragged about his plans to flip this place for twice its value once the old lady's gone. Lisa made my job easier with her social media posts. Turning this dated dump into a modern paradise, she captioned photos of her nursery project, showing before and after shots that clearly displayed the destruction of original craftsman details. James posted videos of himself drilling into walls, accidentally capturing the damage to original plaster, and laugh. Steve grew suspicious of my frequent visits. "You checking up on us?" he asked one afternoon, blocking my path to the stairs. "Visiting my mother in my childhood home," I replied evenly. "Funny how you never visited this much when it was just her here. Funny how much has changed since you arrived." His mask slipped for a moment, revealing something cold underneath. "Your mother's happy. That should be enough for you." "Is she, or is she just afraid of being alone?" "Same difference at her age," he said with a shrug that made my skin crawl. The confrontation I'd been avoiding came when I discovered Steve had contacted a contractor about removing the back wall of the kitchen to create an open-concept living space. The wall was load-bearing, original to the 1923 construction, with built-in china cabinets Dad had spent months restoring. I intercepted the contractor in the driveway. "This work hasn't been approved," I told him, showing him my trusty documentation. "Any modifications to this property require my written consent." Steve stormed out. "You have no right." "I have every right," I countered. "Legal documentation beats whatever story you've sold my mother." "We'll see about that," he snarled. "Your mother's name is on this deed, too." "Yes, it is," I smiled coldly. "But that's not the only document that matters, is it?" That night, Mom called me crying. "How could you embarrass Steve like that? He's trying to make this house better. He's trying to destroy everything Dad built. Your father is dead, Madison. He's gone, and I'm still here trying to live in the house he built for us." "The house he specifically protected from what?" I asked. "From me being happy." The pain in her voice almost broke my resolve. Almost. But then I remembered the sanded door frame, the discarded tools, the systematic erasure of my father from his own home. "No, Mom," I said. "From you being exploited." The line went silent. When she finally spoke, her voice was ice. "Steve was right. You're jealous. You can't stand seeing me with someone else. Well, I'm done letting you control my life with your father's ghost." She hung up. War had officially been declared. The retaliation began within days. Steve understood that if he couldn't win legally, he'd win emotionally. The first salvo came through the mail, an invoice for $8,500 addressed to me for property improvements and maintenance. The letterhead was official-looking, from a property management company Steve had apparently created. The itemized list included his paint jobs, the modern fixtures, even Lisa's nursery renovations. "Tenants are responsible for their share of home improvements," Steve explained when I confronted him, wearing that practiced smile. "Since you maintain partial claim to this property through your father's trust, you owe your portion. I'm not a tenant, and these aren't improvements. They are destruction of historical elements." "Let the courts decide that," he said, clearly hoping I'd drain my savings on legal fees. But the financial harassment was just the beginning. Steve weaponized my mother's emotions with surgical precision. Every Sunday dinner became an ambush. He'd orchestrate scenarios where Mom would beg me to let go of the past while the entire extended family watched. Madison's father would be heartbroken to see her treating Elaine this way, Steve would say sadly, shaking his head. Turning daughter against mother over mere property. Aunt Patricia, Uncle George, my cousins, they all bought into his narrative. I became the villain at every family gathering, the selfish daughter, who valued a house over her mother's happiness. Steve made sure to mention my substantial tech salary whenever money came up, implying I was wealthy enough to not need any inheritance. The masterstroke came when Lisa's pregnancy became his shield. She was 7 months along when she started having complications. Always vague, always dramatic, always requiring bed rest in my childhood room. The stress of possibly being evicted is affecting my baby, Lisa would sob to anyone who'd listen. Madison wants to throw a pregnant woman onto the street. The church community rallied around them. Our pastor, Father Williams, called me personally, he said. Perhaps you could find it in your heart to show Christian mercy. He suggested your mother speaks of how happy Steve makes her. Did she mention he's destroying my father's life's work? Material things, Madison, what matters is family. Even my workplace became a battlefield. Steve somehow discovered my company's HR department email and sent them a concerning message about my aggressive behavior toward my elderly mother and her disabled veteran husband. Steve had never served a day in his life, but he'd found some loophole about civilian contractor work that let him claim veteran-adjacent status. My manager pulled me aside. Everything okay at home? We got a rather disturbing message about some family situation. The humiliation burned, but I kept documenting every lie, every manipulation, every piece of evidence. My apartment became a war room, with files, photographs, and legal documents covering my dining table. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening. Mom called, hysterical. Lisa's in the hospital. The baby's coming early, and it's all because of the stress you've caused. I rushed to Denver General, my heart pounding despite my suspicions. But when I arrived, I found Lisa sitting up in bed, eating ice cream, and laughing with James. No monitors, no signs of distress. Oh, Madison, she said with mock surprise. How nice of you to finally show concern. Mom stood in the corner looking uncomfortable. The doctor said it was false labor, she mumbled, not meeting my eyes. But we thought it was real, Steve added, entering with coffee. The stress in that house is affecting everyone. Perhaps if you'd stop your harassment. My harassment. I pulled out my phone, showing them the string of invoices, the HR complaint, the social media posts. This is orchestrated emotional terrorism. Such dramatic language, Steve tutted. Your mother's right to worry about your mental state. That's when I realized the full scope of his plan. It wasn't just about the house. It was about discrediting me entirely. If he could paint me as unstable, vindictive, possibly dangerous, he could potentially challenge my trustee status on grounds of mental incompetence. I see what you're doing, I said quietly. Steve's smile widened. I'm not doing anything except protecting my family from a bitter woman who can't accept her mother's happiness. That night, I called Henry. They are trying to build a case that I'm mentally unfit. Then we need to move first, he said. I've reviewed all your documentation. We have enough for cease and desist orders. But Madison, this is going to get ugly. Really ugly. Are you prepared for that? I thought about Dad, about the hours we'd spent in his workshop, about his careful hands teaching me to build things that last. I thought about the door frame painted over like we'd never existed. I'm prepared. There's something else, Henry said. I've been doing some research on Mr. Dawson. His previous wife's death certificate lists cancer, but there were some irregularities in her estate distribution. Her adult children from her first marriage contested the will, claiming undue influence. They lost. But the pattern is interesting. He's done this before. Possibly. I've reached out to his former stepchildren. They are willing to talk to you. Off the record. That's when I understood Steve wasn't just an opportunist. He was a professional. And Mom wasn't his first victim. But he'd made one crucial mistake. He'd chosen to target Richard Carter's daughter. And Dad had taught me that when you build something to last, you start with an unshakable foundation. The war was about to escalate. And this time, I had ammunition he never saw coming. The meeting was set for a Friday evening at the house. I'd sent formal letters to Mom, Steve, Lisa, and James, requesting their presence for an estate discussion. Henry would be there along with Margaret Foster from the Denver Historical Society, and surprisingly, 2 unexpected guests I'd invited after my research. I arrived early, finding Mom alone in the kitchen. She looked older, exhausted. The spark Steve had supposedly rekindled now dimmed to barely an ember. "Madison, please," she started, "can't we just—" "Mom, I need you to listen tonight. Really listen, not to Steve. Not to your fear of being alone. Listen to the truth." Before she could respond, Steve walked in with Lisa and James trailing behind. His confidence faltered slightly when he saw Henry and Margaret already seated in the living room with their briefcases open. "What is this?" Steve demanded. "A family meeting," I said calmly. "Please sit down." "We don't need lawyers for a family discussion," he blustered. "Actually, you do," Henry stood, adjusting his glasses. "Mr. Dawson, I'm here to inform you that you're in violation of multiple legal agreements regarding this property." I pulled out my documentation, binders of evidence, photographs, receipts. Margaret Foster opened her laptop, displaying a slideshow of the house's historical elements that had been destroyed or altered. "This property is protected under the Denver Historical Preservation Covenant," Margaret explained. "These modifications," she clicked through images of Steve's changes, "constitute criminal destruction of historical property. Each violation carries a penalty of up to $10,000. "That's ridiculous," Steve sputtered. "I've improved this place." "You've destroyed 93 documented historical elements," I said, reading from my list. "Original craftsman built-ins, period-appropriate fixtures, restored hardwood details. The total damages exceed $200,000. Lisa laughed nervously. "You can't be serious. We're family." "No," I said firmly. "You're opportunists who saw a grieving widow and decided to take advantage." "How dare you?" Steve started to rise, but stopped when the doorbell rang. I'd saved the best for last. 2 people entered, a man and woman in their 40s. Looking uncomfortable but determined. "Mom?" "Steve," I said. "I'd like you to meet Robert and Sandra Mitchell. Steve's former stepchildren." The color drained from Steve's face. "You had no right." "They reached out to me," Robert said quietly. "When Mr. Lawson contacted us, we felt we had to warn you." He turned to my mother. "Steve married our mother 3 years after our father died. Within 18 months, he'd convinced her to sell our childhood home, liquidate our father's business assets, and move into a condo he picked out. She died 8 months later." "The cancer was real," Sandra added quickly. "But the estate manipulation started long before she got sick. By the time she died, everything our father had built was gone. Sold or destroyed, Steve and his children got everything." Mom's hand went to her throat. "That's not Steve." "They are lying," Steve said, but his usual smooth confidence was gone. "Their mother wanted to simplify her life." "You mean you wanted to simplify the conversion of her assets," Robert said. "We have the paperwork, the pattern of property transfers, the suspicious timing of new wills. We couldn't prove undue influence in court, but we can show the pattern." Henry pulled out more documents. "Mr. Dawson, you've done this at least twice before. The widow Morrison in Colorado Springs, the widow Garrett in Fort Collins. Each time you move in, your children follow, and within 2 years, the estate is liquidated." "You can't prove anything," Steve said, but he was sweating now. "I don't have to prove it in criminal court," I said. "But I can prove it in civil court. And more importantly, I can prove the damages to this house." I turned to Mom. He was never interested in you. He was interested in a $1.2 million property in a historic neighborhood. Mom sank into Dad's chair. Steve's recliner had been pushed aside for this meeting. Steve, tell them they're wrong, Mom pleaded. But Steve was calculating, his eyes darting between the lawyers, the evidence, his children. Lisa had gone pale, her hand on her pregnant belly. James was already edging toward the door. Here's what's going to happen, I said, standing. You're going to leave this house tonight, all of you. You're going to return every single item you've sold or discarded, or pay for its replacement. You're going to pay for professional historical restoration of everything you've damaged, and then you're going to disappear from our lives forever. Or, Steve tried to salvage some bravado. Or I file criminal charges for destruction of historical property, fraud, elder abuse, and theft, I continued, my voice unwavering. The Denver DA is very interested in patterns of predatory behavior toward widows. Robert and Sandra have agreed to testify about your pattern of conduct. Your pregnant daughter can explain her actions to a judge. Lisa started crying. Dad, Mom sobbed, you said this was different. You said you loved Elaine. Steve's mask finally shattered completely. He looked at my mother with something like contempt. Your husband was smart to lock this place up legally, he sneered. Smarter than the others. Mom gasped as if she'd been slapped. The admission hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Get out, she whispered, then louder. Get out of my house. Steve stood, his children scrambling to follow. You'll regret this, he said to me. No, I replied. But you will. Henry has already frozen the joint account you convinced Mom to open. Margaret has flagged you with every historical society in Colorado, and Robert and Sandra are finally getting their story heard. As they gathered their things under supervision, Mom collapsed against me, sobbing. I'm so sorry, Madison. I was so lonely. And he seemed. I know, Mom. I know. The house felt different with them gone, like it could finally breathe again. But I knew our work was just beginning. The house needed restoration. Mom needed healing. The eviction day arrived grey and drizzling. Fitting weather for an exorcism. I'd hired off-duty police officers for security, Henry's suggestion, after Steve's "You'll regret this" threat. Mom stayed at my apartment, unable to watch the man she'd trusted remove his claws from our home. Steve arrived with a rental truck and his children, their faces set in sullen anger. Lisa's pregnancy had become her shield again. She moved slowly, dramatically, making sure the neighbors saw her struggle. Several had gathered on their porches, drawn by the police presence and the drama. 3 hours, I told Steve, checking my watch. Everything that belongs to you leaves this house. Everything that belongs to us stays. Or what? He gestured at Lisa. You'll have a pregnant woman arrested. If necessary, I turned to Officer Martinez. Please supervise the master bedroom. Make sure they only take what's theirs. The process was methodical and tense. I had an inventory of every item in the house, photographs from before Steve's arrival. When James tried to take Dad's leather-bound books, claiming Steve had bought them, I produced receipts from 2010. Nice try, I said, taking them back. Steve's mask of civility cracked more with each hour. When he couldn't take the smart TV he'd mounted over Dad's fireplace, he accidentally knocked over a vase. When told he couldn't take the new appliances he'd installed without providing the originals he'd discarded, he kicked the wall, leaving a dent. Document everything, Henry whispered. And Margaret Foster photographed each incident. The real confrontation came at Dad's workshop. Steve had stored countless boxes there, but mixed among them were Dad's restored tools he'd claimed were thrown away. I found them wrapped in garbage bags hidden behind his golf clubs. "Stealing from the dead," I said, loud enough for the neighbors to hear. "That's a new low, even for you." "Prove they weren't mine," Steve snarled. I pulled out Dad's workshop journal, showing his meticulous records of every tool purchase, complete with photos. "Page 47, I said. "Purchased at estate sale 2018. Your move." By noon, their possessions were loaded. But Steve had one more card to play. As he walked through the house for the final check, he stopped at the repainted doorframe, the one where my height marks had been. "Such a shame," he said loudly. "All those memories painted over, but that was Elaine's idea. You know, she wanted to erase the painful reminders." I knew he was lying, but the words were meant for the neighbors, for anyone who'd listened to his version later. This was Steve's specialty, leaving just enough doubt, just enough alternative narrative. "Actually," Margaret Foster stepped forward, "I have documentation that proves otherwise." Mrs. Carter filed a complaint with our office about unauthorized modifications. Steve's expression darkened. "You've thought of everything, haven't you?" "My father taught me to be thorough," I replied. Lisa chose that moment for her grand performance. She clutched her belly, gasping. "The stress, I can't. I need to sit down." "In the truck," I said coldly. "Your 3 hours are up." "You're heartless," she screamed, throwing out a pregnant woman. "I hope you never have children. You don't deserve them." James stepped between us, trying to look threatening. "You're going to pay for humiliating my family." Officer Martinez moved forward. "Is that a threat, sir?" James backed down, but Steve wasn't finished. He pulled out his phone, filming me. "Everyone needs to see what kind of person Madison Carter really is. Destroying her mother's happiness, traumatizing a pregnant woman, all for money." "All for justice," I corrected. "And you're trespassing now." As they drove away, Steve shouted from the truck window, "This isn't over. Your mother will beg me to come back when she realizes what you've done." Mrs. Chen from next door approached me carefully. "Madison, dear," she said, "was all that necessary. Your mother seemed so happy." "She seemed happy when my father was alive, too," I said. "Real happiness doesn't require destroying everything someone built." That evening, I brought Mom back home. She walked through the room slowly, seeing the damage clearly for the first time, the painted woodwork, the missing fixtures, the modernized spaces that clashed with Dad's vision. "How did I let this happen?" she whispered, running her fingers along the ruined built-in shelving. "You were grieving." He was a predator, who knew exactly what to say. She stopped at the doorframe, touching the fresh white paint. "He did this while I was at my doctor's appointment. Told me it was a surprise to freshen things up." I cried for hours. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I'd already chosen him over you. I was too ashamed to admit I'd made a mistake." She turned to me, tears streaming. "Your father would be so disappointed in me." "No," I said firmly. "He'd be disappointed in Steve," I said. "You were manipulated by a professional con artist. Dad would just want you safe." We stood in the living room, surveying the damage, but also the potential. The bones of the house, Dad's true craftsmanship, remained strong. "We'll restore it," I promised. "Every detail. I have all of Dad's notes, his suppliers, his plans. We'll bring it back." Mom nodded. Then pulled something from her purse. "An envelope yellowed with age," she said. "I found this in our safe deposit box yesterday. It's from your father, addressed to both of us." Inside, Dad's familiar handwriting read, my dear girls, if you're reading this together, then you've weathered a storm. The house may have scars, but foundations built with love don't crumble easily. Fight for each other, forgive each other, and remember what we build with our hands matters less than what we build with our hearts. Restore what you can, accept what you can't, and know that I'm proud of you both. We cried together, surrounded by the wounded house that had protected us even when we couldn't protect it. Tomorrow, the restoration would begin. But tonight, for the first time in months, we were home. 6 months later, the house breathed again with Dad's spirit. The restoration had become a pilgrimage of sorts, drawing in unexpected allies. Dad's old craftsmen emerged from retirement when they heard what had happened. Tom Martinez, with his expertise in historical millwork. Eugene Park, with his collection of period-appropriate hardware. Sally Morrison, with her vast knowledge of restoration techniques. Richard would have haunted me if I didn't help, Tom said, carefully reinstalling the built-in shelving with woodwood sourced from the same mill Dad had used decades ago. The door frame became our first victory. We stripped away Steve's paint carefully, hoping to find some trace of our history underneath. The pencil marks were gone, but Tom had an idea. Using Dad's photographs and his meticulous records, we recreated every single mark, every date, every height, not forgetting the past, but honoring it through careful reconstruction. Mom threw herself into the restoration with surprising vigor. She learned to strip paint from hardware, to distinguish between original fixtures and replacements, to appreciate the craftsmanship Dad had tried to teach us both. Working with our hands side by side, we talked about Dad without the weight of grief, remembering his perfectionism, his terrible jokes, his insistence on measuring twice, cutting once. I understand now, she said one afternoon, carefully sanding a piece of reclaimed oak. This house wasn't just shelter. It was his love letter to us. The workshop became my sanctuary. We restored it exactly as Dad had left it. With one addition, a framed photo of him at his workbench, smiling over his shoulder, as if he'd just heard us come in. His tools, recovered from Steve's theft, hung in their familiar places. I spent evenings there, working on small projects, feeling closer to him than I had since his death. Word spread about what Steve had done. Robert and Sandra Mitchell's testimony, combined with our evidence, triggered an investigation that revealed 4 more victims across 3 states. Steve's pattern was always the same, widowed women with valuable property and emotional vulnerability. The Denver DA filed charges for fraud and elder abuse. Steve ultimately pleaded guilty to avoid trial, receiving 5 years probation and restitution orders he'd probably never fully pay. Lisa had her baby, a girl, and sent a single message through her lawyer, an apology and a promise to never contact us again. James disappeared entirely. Their family of grifters had scattered like roaches when the lights came on. The house's revival attracted attention from the Denver Historical Society. Margaret Foster featured it in their newsletter as a cautionary tale, but also a triumph of preservation. The Carter House stands as testimony that our architectural heritage can survive not just time and weather, but human greed, she wrote. On the first anniversary of Dad's death, we held an open house. The restoration was complete. Every detail lovingly returned to his vision. Neighbors who'd watched the drama unfold came to see the transformation. Even Mrs. Chen, who'd questioned my actions, admitted the house had never looked better. Your father would be so proud, she said, admiring the restored craftsman details. Standing in the living room that evening, surrounded by people who'd known and loved Dad, I realized something profound. Steve had tried to erase my father, to paint over him like those pencil marks on the doorframe, but Dad had built something deeper than wood and plaster. He'd built knowledge, skills, and values that couldn't be demolished. Mom stood beside me, stronger now, wearing one of Dad's old work shirts she'd kept. You know what I learned from all this, she said quietly. What's that? Your father didn't just teach you about restoration. He taught you about resilience, about fighting for what matters. I forgot that lesson for a while, but you didn't. We both needed reminding, I said, squeezing her hand. The house stood around us, solid and real. Every joint and beam a testament to craftsmanship and care. Steve had thought he'd taken everything from us, our home, our family unity, our memories. But he'd failed to understand the most important thing. What's built with love and skill can be damaged but not destroyed. It can be painted over but not erased. It can be attacked but not defeated. In trying to steal our inheritance, Steve had actually strengthened it. Mom and I were closer than we'd been in years. The house was more beautiful than ever. And Dad's legacy, his true legacy of integrity, craftsmanship, and fierce protection of what matters, lived on in every restored detail. That night, I stood in the workshop, running my hands over Dad's workbench. I'd won the war Steve had started. But more importantly, I'd kept the promise every child makes to a parent they've lost, to remember, to honor, and to protect what they held dear. The house was saved. The family was healing. And somewhere, I knew Dad was proud. Looking back now, I realize this story isn't just about a house or revenge. It's about the foundations we inherit, not just property and possessions, but values, skills, and the courage to stand against those who would destroy what we love. Steve thought he was stealing a fortune in real estate. He never understood he was trying to steal something priceless, and ultimately unshakable. The love between a father and daughter, expressed in wood and stone, preserved in memory and will, and defended with the fierce protection of someone who refuses to let the past be painted over. Thank you for listening to my story. Sometimes the greatest revenge isn't destroying those who wronged us, but simply refusing to let them win.